Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shannon Derehove. Welcome to today's webinar on sustainable practices in the transportation and logistics industry, hosted on behalf of DMG Events Transport Evolution. Sustainability in the transport and logistics industry is no longer a nice to have, but rather essential in the way the industry responds to social and governmental pressure. This shift doesn't only lead to minimizing the environmental impact, but has a substantial effect on business relationships and the bottom line. Join us as an expert panel unpacks this idea. Before we start, please note that the chat and the Q&A are available to you. Please post your questions in the Q&A and your comments in the chat. Both the Q&A and the chat are at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware that we're recording this webinar and we'll send the recording to you when it's available. We're also streaming the webinar live on YouTube and we'll share the link in the chat once it's available. So let's get started. Today's moderator is Joshua Lowe, Vice President South Africa of DMG Events. Joshua builds and leads teams, creates strategies, develops innovative ideas and new opportunities that have proven to result in growth, achievement of sales targets, and profitability. He will facilitate the discussion with today's panel, which consists of Sophia Sibanda, Head of Logistics and Services Procurement at AP Moller Maersk; Margot Ann Werner, Legal Director at Pinsent Masons; Lusanda Madikizela, Head of Zero Emission Freight at C40 Cities; Ikponwosa Egbai, the Group Head for Supply Chain at Emzor Pharmaceutical Industries in Nigeria; and Professor Mohamed Mustafa, Chair and Director for the KZN DoT in Sustainable Transportation at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I'll hand over now to moderator Joshua Lowe to start the discussion. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Shannon, and welcome to my fellow panelists. It's really nice to be such an esteemed panel to lead this webinar today on what is really a very hot topic, and I would encourage the audience to really participate. This is very much going to be run as an interactive session driven by Q&As. So as Shannon was saying, if you've got a question, please use the Q&A functionality, put your comments in the comment section, and we'll try and get to as many of the questions as we can. Before we get started, maybe a bit of an introduction in terms of who DMG Events are. We are one of the world's largest trade fair organizers. In South Africa, we organize events across the transport, mining, food and beverage, hotel, and hospitality sectors. We are also the organizers of Transport Evolution Africa, Africa's Transport and Logistics Exhibition and Conference, which will be taking place from the 17th to the 19th of June at Gallagher Convention Centre in Johannesburg, South Africa. It is the only event in Africa which looks at transport from a multimodal perspective, looking at the interlink between road, rail, ports and air. The only event which looks at transport corridor development and the importance of regional and international integration to drive economic growth in Africa. And the only event in Africa which explores the role of transport in unlocking economic potential of SEZs and IDZs. For more information or to inquire about exhibiting, sponsoring or attending the event, please visit the website at www.transportevolution.com. That's www.transportevolution.com. Okay, without further ado, I see we have people who are joining us from Spain, from Ethiopia, from all around Africa, so it's very exciting. Thank you again for joining. So far, we have 115 people on the webinar, so we've got a significant audience. And I'm going to dive straight into the questions. And the first one is directed at Professor Mustafa and IK. So IK and Professor, how far along is the South African and African transport and logistics industry to transitioning to sustainable practices?
All right, thank you, Joshua, for the question. If IK allow me to start, I will say that the African industry is moving towards sustainability, but it's like moving through sand. Progress is slow and uneven. So yes, companies are testing greener practices like cutting fuel, adopting energy-saving technology, and doubling in solar power. But for most of these companies, sustainability is still a side project, not a core strategy. And if we ask why, basically because it has been seen as costly and complicated. The root problem here is infrastructure, which was built in the past. Africa's colonial era rail system are crumbling, forcing us to rely on roads, which guzzle fuel and clog cities with emissions. So basically, in South Africa, we talk about electric trucks, for example, but coal is powering 80% of our electricity. So basically, EVs are shifting pollution from road power plants. In Kenya, they are bypassing all systems entirely, using solar-powered logistics hubs. But progress is patchy, weak regulations, uh, political chaos in some regions, they stall momentum. There are some good news, however, that sustainability is becoming a survival tactic. Uh, for example, in South Africa, the Carbon Tax Act is nudging companies to cut emissions or pay up. International funders are backing green ports, renewable energy projects like Namibia Wolves Bay. So the bottom line is we are at a crossroad. To turn small steps into real change, sustainability must become synonym with economic growth. Green choices need to mean cheaper, faster, and more competitive logistics, not just a moral win. Yeah, with that, Kate, can you jump in, please?
Okay. Good day, everyone. Thank you for having me. Just to ride on the back of Professor, there's a huge innovation and there's a drive towards this transition at the moment in South Africa and also in across the other African countries. So, South Africa has a clear-cut objective on carbon reduction goals, and this also includes the commitment under the Paris Agreement. So that's a step in the right direction. Also, the renewable energy innovations as well as electric vehicles and deployment. All of these are roadmaps towards the transitioning. And then we quite know that a couple of bimodal transport systems have been invented. A couple of governments are investing massively in railway, which would help to channel materials and products from one destination to the other. But all of this come with a couple of challenges, some of which include high cost and of infrastructure. Also, the transitioning from electric vehicle to hydrogen power trucks is also a major challenge because the cost of infrastructure is quite massive. And many logistics firms still sort of depend on the traditional diesel-powered trucks. We also look at the slow implementation of policies. Some of these are the challenges that we're currently facing in Africa, but I would say that we are moving progressively to a destination that in the next few years, there's going to be a significant impact in the transition into these development goals. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting comments. I'm going to go straight on then to the second question. And this one is directed at Lucinda and Sophia. So maybe, Sophia, if you can go first in answering or responding to it. What are some of the simple solutions that can be implemented to reduce industry's carbon footprint? I know IK and Professor were talking about, for example, the move towards hydrogen-powered vehicles, EVs. But are there some other creative ways in which we can just get started on this process or try and accelerate the move to sustainable practices?
Yeah, I think the points that the gentleman actually raised were quite critical. But then, and it's important, especially when companies talk around the fact that it is expensive. So then, how do you then combine that with what is happening operationally? So largely I've worked within the trucking industry, and at the moment I get to work in the hybrid of both of ocean and landside. Your route optimizing solutions, that's for me like where you can hit it on the nail operationally and you can feel it immediately. So when you look at softwares like your route optimization, so when you look at TMS, you minimize the distance that is being traveled, you minimize the fuel consumption and therefore the emissions that are taking place. I think it's never been such a more important time for companies to invest in their TMS systems, because of all the additional modules or interventions that exist in terms of that natural evolution. So when you start talking triangulation, volume smoothing, fleet mix, entity zoning exercises that you always add in support of your transport management system, all of those have an impact. Yes, they've got an impact on the operational efficiencies and savings, but then you also see a direct correlation with your emissions, and therefore it then connects to strategy as well. Second point is exactly that, strategy. I think conversations need to start happening as companies start looking at their longer term view, especially companies as large as Maersk, for example. Am I asset light or am I going to be asset heavy? If I'm asset heavy and I've also partnered or I've got subcontractors that are also asset heavy, then you're not helping the conversation. Then we're kind of increasing or making the problem bigger. So there's a natural symbiotic relationship between an asset light, major company partnering with your smaller subcontractors. That's an opportunity to then drive your performance through your partners. And I think one of the simple things that we forget, we can have all these big plans, but when we start talking sustainability, it starts becoming such a expert discussion. The training and awareness that needs to happen at an employee level is critical, and I think that's something that we miss quite easily and too often. You need the people in your company to be your champions. And in order for them to do that, they don't need to have expert knowledge of it. It's about making sure that the information is readily available and is consistently shared with your employees. And I think something else also from a warehousing perspective, just in terms of your waste reduction. So at Maersk, we've got a stringent waste management process that we hold ourselves accountable to, but also our partners. So it's even part of our screening process as we start off our RFQs and RFPs. And we put certain clauses that allows us that, when you sign on to be our partner, this is what the expectation is, and how do we then also support you? Because then, also, another thing about understanding the South African landscape is the fact that you want to drive elements like your BEE. That means you're working with companies that are much smaller and don't have access to certain technology, and being able to partner with them and being able to have interventions as part of your process to bring them along on the journey as well. Yeah, and that's from my side. Lusanda?
Thanks, Sophia. I think I'll pick up on your point around strategy, because I think this is a very important one, right? That the strategy of the company around how it wants to sort of see how it sees itself in business in 10, 15 years' time. The discussions around carbon footprint reduction are also very much linked to economics, right? I think we've seen since COVID years that it has also become an economic imperative to run a lean and mean machine as a business that you can sustain for a very long time. So minimization of waste, as you mentioned, Sophia, is one of the most important ones, and it starts across your operations, whether you're talking route planning optimization that you've already mentioned, packaging, talking about when you're talking at the logistics chain itself, ensuring that you're using the right-sized vehicles for the right type of operations so as to minimize waste in terms of the kilometers driven, whether it's kilometers to delivery or the dead kilometers coming back from deliveries, trying to minimize that. Implementing now in the urban logistics space, which is where C40 Cities works, in the main, trying to implement hub and spoke means of operation where your warehouse is closest to where you need to do your deliveries, and ensuring that you minimize the dead kilometers, using the right size vehicles, ensuring that you have multiple uses for your vehicles, to ensure that you're really stretching everything that you have as a resource as far as possible. And I think what we haven't really discussed is collaboration with other companies. You mentioned this a little bit, Sophia, around sharing underused assets, for instance, ensuring that you're partnering with the right companies where you can complement each other's operations. What stops, for instance, in the South African context, take a lot from partnering up with an Amazon for warehouses, as an example, so that you share the space and you don't have a scenario where every single logistics operator or service provider has got its own space, its own vehicles, its own delivery mechanisms. There is ways and opportunities to try and integrate and improve operations. So I think I agree with everything that's been said, but I would add that importantly, reducing carbon footprint is also an economic imperative as well.
And just going back to your point, so I'm going a bit off script here because it's not listed in the question, so bear with me. But obviously strategies come up a lot from what you both said. What would be, if there's a company in the sector who's looking to start on the sustainability journey, what would you say would be the first sort of 2 to 3 steps that they need to think about in terms of just getting going? Because I think when I engage with companies in this sector and across many sectors when it comes to sustainability, part of the challenge is just not knowing where to start and how to start. So what would your advice be to those sort of companies, especially who are attending today?
Should I go first, Sophia? Okay, I'll go.
You may go.
I think as we were talking about strategy, it's important as you're drafting strategy as a company to sort of make pronouncements and write down a vision for where you see yourself as an organization from a footprint perspective, and then set the necessary targets that will get you to that place, whether you're talking 20 years time or 15 years time. So setting the targets that we want to reduce from our operations, we want to reduce waste by X percentage. From our operations, if you're using delivery vehicles, for instance, starting by saying you want to decarbonize your fleet, and set a target and you say we want to decarbonize our fleet 20% by this year, and it according. So that's really important, trying to mirror how you present yourself as a company from a strategy perspective with the targets that you have set for yourself, and roll out in a very measured way that is also in line with the finances and the balance sheet of the company, to ensure that there is a great balance between what you're trying to do for the planet and for the bottom line as a company.
Yeah, again, I think Lusanda, you and I are quite connected in our answers. But I think that's what I want to add. I think what maybe another pitfall that most companies kind of fall into when they start is it's expected that, okay, we're just going to do this and we'll all just going to figure it out as we go along. This is not something that can be a side gig, right? We have and I'll try and use examples, but we've got a specific department called the decarbonization team, right? That this is their sole purpose in the business. So, from Lusanda's point around, okay, set the strategy, but then the strategy requires a plan to underpin it. In that plan, there needs to be a dedicated, even because let's say it's a smaller company and you're starting small, doesn't need to be a full team, but there needs to be someone specifically who is there because then they understand the numbers, they understand the politics about it, they understand the economics of it, and they're able to then translate that to a simple set of KPIs and language that is easily absorbed by the rest of the teams. So that is critical. And then it's also, don't start too big, right? I know that those leaders, and we're at a point where we're like, we're not moving fast enough, but we also don't want to say that to deter anyone from starting. So start as small as you can. That's why some of the examples that
Yeah.
Lusanda and I spoke about, literally route planning.
Yes.
Even if you don't have a TMS system because your company is small, route planning is something you can
Yes.
do even on Excel, right? And like in terms of understanding how far each of my warehouses and cross-dock facilities are and how I do, you can literally start tracking it from literally just that small. And once you start tracking that, and then obviously making sure that from a regulatory perspective, you know, these numbers are tracked and are fed in, you start then building a case for what is required, and that looks at existing, and then you know what we also then look at if the business is growing, right? So if the business is growing and we're starting to talk around investments and new facilities, start like that is a beautiful place to begin as well, to say if we're now applying for IP approval, etc., put it in that line, put it in that cost line, because again, a lot of people get deterred by the startup cost, but then you also, and I mean, I'll touch on it even more later, but then when you start talking about the benefits of this, the total cost of ownership in terms of the impact it starts having on your operational cost line is beautiful, but again, it requires patience.
Yeah. And it's great because, you know, again, when I talk to companies, I mean, a lot of it is a lack of awareness around what to do, what the first steps are to get going. And this assumption that they have to do everything at once and that it's going to cost a lot of money. And I think those three things deter companies from even getting going or starting on the process. So thank you both for those responses. I'm going to move on to Professor Nike had mentioned, and I'm going to direct this question at Lusanda again, but also to Margot. What types of policy and legislative frameworks are needed to drive this transition?
Okay, maybe I can go first. I know, Margot, you are the legal.
Struggling to find the mute button. I was going to say, yes, Lusanda, would you mind going first?
Sure. So this is the space that we work in as C40 cities the most, because we really want to support the government sector to really lay out a sort of a legislative and policy framework that supports companies who want to make that transition. So a lot of companies, as we already discussed, don't know where to start. So normally the first port of call before you draft your strategy, you look at what is the legislative environment that you're operating in, what is required of you as a company, and then you build your strategy around that. So in an environment where there is none, whether it is specific what you need to comply with, or at least an incentive licensing scheme or approach that really wants to encourage companies to sort of set off on their decarbonization targets and know that when they have access to these kinds of supportive policies and even financial incentives and schemes that can actually help them to finance their transition and move faster. So it's very, very important for governments, whether we're talking national or city governments, to really come to the party for companies to encourage. And then, of course, it has to be a combination of both encouraging and using a set of legislations to sort of compel companies, those that are moving slow, to set on that transition, because it's for the good of society, it's good for the good of everyone, that the companies that are operating in this day and age have those kinds of and move towards a reduced carbon footprint as fast as possible. So it's very important to then set out, as I said, targets and policies on what are the financial incentives. If you as a company, for instance, have made a commitment that you want to electrify your fleet, are there supportive incentives that would maybe help with VAT or any other type of tax write-offs, or reducing the duties, any of those things that can support companies to make the vehicle cheaper for them, and therefore they can then roll out their electrification programs faster than they would have. Or if you're talking about reducing packaging or introducing packaging that is more environmentally friendly, a lot of investment would go into that type of project and roll out. So what is the incentive for companies, whether it's a tax incentive or another supportive policy that would encourage companies to, even if they were planning to do it over 15 years, to then shorten that period to maybe 7 years and be able to participate or benefit from a supportive policy for their business. So I think it's a combination of both carrot and stick approaches, but more carrot to ensure that, again, companies can see within their bottom lines how they're actually going to finance the transition. Over to you, Margot.
Thanks, Lysanda. You've really sort of set a nice base for me to leverage off, because just to draw from all the other panelists, a lot of really important terms popped up. So things around how slow policy is being implemented. This transition is moving at a snail's pace. How do we figure out the strategy? I think that's all linked to certainty within the policy and legislative space. That certainty would be an absolute trigger and allow for sort of a baseline really for the sector to then establish what are the actual goals, what are the requirements, what am I working towards? So having that certainty from a policy and legislative perspective feeds into the strategy that a company in the sector would want to implement and guide that ultimate transition holistically with the sector as a whole, achieving its eventual targets. And I'll touch on why I say eventual. So without a doubt, policy and legislation are really material enablers to implementing sustainability in the transport sector. And I think what's a little bit frustrating, but at the same time encouraging, is that in South Africa, certainly we have existing policies that speak to the transport sector, that speak to the decarbonization of the transport sector and sort of its contributing sectors, because we cannot sort of view the transport sector on its own. It contributes significantly from an emissions perspective to other sectors, and other sectors, of course, contribute to the transport sector from an emissions perspective. And so it's important to actually view the value chain, the entire value chain within which the transport sector falls, to really achieve that ultimate goal of true sustainability. But I mean, starting point being within the sector itself. And again, we do have that benefit of existing policies. I mean, one such policy is our Green Transport Strategy, which looks at the period of 2018 to 2025. And within that policy, or within that strategy rather, there is sort of this goal to achieve a 5% reduction in the greenhouse gas emission contribution that the transport sector makes. Now, that contribution, according to our draft sectoral target report that came out last year, is the second highest emitting sector in South Africa after energy. So that really brings it into perspective of the footprint the transport sector represents from at least a carbon footprint perspective. Lysanda absolutely acknowledging that sustainability is much broader, and Sophia, you also touched on it. So sustainability is much broader. It's definitely our climate change focus and carbon footprint mitigation efforts, but then of course all other sustainability factors around water, waste management, social impacts, and how they all tie in. But with the biggest focus, and I guess maybe the most urgent action is certainly addressing the carbon footprint of this sector. But with that sort of reduction goal that's specified in the Green Transport Strategy, how does the sector actually achieve that? So we actually need legislation that will drive that change, that will unfortunately move us, well, fortunately, in the sense that it will result in a movement out of sort of this voluntary compliance space in light of no strict compliance provisions. So if we really consider it at this point in time, sustainability choices are very much voluntary in the sector and in many other sectors. But legislation will then be that driver to bring into place actual compliance obligations. And with compliance comes real risk of, having to uphold those obligations, having to meet the necessary legislative requirements, whether they are thresholds or targets or budgets in whatever shape or form. But as it stands, we don't have that. And so it's sort of crunch time, certainly in my view, where we have a lot more certainty as to what is it that we need to achieve in the sector from a sustainability perspective and certainly from a decarbonization perspective. What are the goals that we're trying to achieve from a reduction perspective? How do we achieve that? Some of the legislation and some of the policies sort of set out sort of three enabling areas. Sort of one being the adoption of more innovative technology, such as the adoption or the use of electric vehicles, whether it be battery or fuel cell. The consideration around the use of hydrogen, and again, of course, the type of hydrogen, whether it's green, because of course that speaks to the sustainability aspect and the taxonomy, I guess, of what constitutes green. And then, of course, sort of changing our way of living really as a society and moving away from our current practices of being so heavily reliant on road transportation to other options. But we don't have those options yet, certainly not from an infrastructure perspective, especially in the rail space, as an example. So there is a lot in terms of all the contributors to the sector, and designating and allocating the underlying policy to addressing each of those aspects within the sector. And then from that policy, actually having enabling legislation to realize and implement the steps that are needed to realize sustainability. And sort of just in closing, one piece of legislation that we can all appreciate that was passed last year, being our Climate Change Act, I think will be a trigger to seeing some level of movement. Although the Climate Change Act has been passed into law, it is not in effect. It itself is only a framework piece of legislation. So from it will stem regulations that still need to be developed. We are still yet to decide on our sectoral emission targets, with the transport sector being one of those very identified sectors. So there's still quite a long way to go. But hopefully, just by virtue of sort of voluntary adoption of best practice, once that enabling legislation comes into place where compliance is now no longer a choice, that behavior will translate into effective compliance with the eventual legislation, which we hope will come.
Thank you both.
Thanks,
and
Josh.
Again, going a bit off script, and a question directed to you both again. Just are there any countries or examples that you can give our audience that are kind of getting it right, as it were, in terms of their policy and regulatory framework in driving sustainable practices within the sector?
So I would actually,
Sandra, I don't know if
China as a country that has made great strides, particularly with electrification, and so it's a complex answer because China, on the one hand, is one of our biggest polluters, right, in the whole world, and that's where most of our coal is going. So that's one thing. But in terms of if you want to sort of have a narrow view of trying to decarbonize transport and logistics, China, again, has also made great strides in making sure that the right kind of technology is available for all the things that we've just discussed, and also a wide range of vehicles are available to companies for them to actually decarbonize their fleets, because they have very big air quality challenges as well. They also have made great strides in experimenting with things like nighttime deliveries that actually prioritize zero-emission vehicles, for instance. So if you're a company that has positioned yourself accordingly and ensured that you are the one that is most advanced with transitioning to zero-emission fleets, you have that advantage, right, in terms of operations, that you've got access to certain parts of town more than companies that are still operating your dirtier fleets of vehicles. So that is a competitive advantage, right? So this is how that sort of policy nudge, before you even talk about complying, but nudging companies with the right kind of incentives to give them competitive advantages, the ones that do actually decarbonize faster than others. So it's really a combination of things that you cannot legislate your way into everything, but some of that have to be aspirational because the company wants to get a competitive advantage and also wants to get a closer relationship with their consumers, for instance, because these are things that you put in your reports and be able to brag about, that we've been able to move this much faster than our competitors. So I would mention that also there are certain countries across the Europe region that are doing well with zero emission zones that target, for instance, ensuring that certain companies that are operating zero emission fleets gain preferential access, and also really looking at the urban logistics space to try and ensure that land use and the way land use planning is done really incorporates freight movement design and movements early on, and trying to ensure that there's less competition between the different modes, like people and your cars and various things. So there are quite a number of countries and cities that are making strides to ensure that the way movement of goods is done in their spaces is safer for both the commuters and consumers, and also much more competitive for private companies as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I think it's quite a nice segue. I know I was going to ask this question a bit later on, but Margot, again, maybe directed at you, just following on with what Luzanda said. I mean, if we all agree that we should try and drive a change through carrot more than stick, what are the benefits that companies are recognizing, you know, from these sustainable practices, the ones that are implementing them? You know, because a lot of companies might look at this and go, well, you know, the measures at the moment are only voluntary, they're not compulsory. Why don't I just sit back and wait until they do become compulsory? I mean, what would you say to companies who have that kind of response or that view in terms of the broader benefits?
Thanks, Josh. I think Luzanda actually mentioned it, that aspect around competitive advantage, especially sectors that will be impacted by the developments happening sort of more in the Northern Hemisphere. The restrictions that are already implemented there around, or not so much restrictions, or rather requirements around sort of what, you know, the carbon content really of a product or a service has, that will be obviously that will influence how you then reduce your footprint in relation to that service or that product, even in the transport sector. So by sort of adhering as to what will eventually come, CBAM is a good example of that.
Yes.
By implementing that anticipatory or horizon-looking approach, you sort of then are ahead of the curve from a sector, you know, within the sector to adopt, you know, either more innovative solutions, efficiencies, you know, and I speak very generically because the sector is so incredibly vast, from road to rail to aviation to shipping, all different types of technologies, all contributing somehow to the value chain. But it really is sort of acknowledging that it will become a stick at some point. That best practice approach will prepare one within the sector to respond at the appropriate time. And you will be one of those that are leading the pack in terms of readiness to respond. Furthermore, it gives you that sort of standout opportunity, you know, in relation to your clients or your, you know, even your service providers about, you know, about really, again, sort of standing out from your sustainability approach, definitely more attractive because your efforts contribute to their sort of either ESG or sustainability commitments. So it really is sort of quite a nice cycle. It's just about that cycle moving efficiently. But yes, and I mean, it also speaks to sort of the finance space and lender requirements that are, again, very much being aligned to sustainability practices. You know, it's no longer a choice when seeking financing to pick and choose whether you want to do an assessment of your, you know, your either your carbon emission inventory for the life cycle of your operations. You know, it's now sort of become a requirement, certainly from a lending perspective. So a lot of factors, you know, it's sort of at the time where voluntary is now necessary, but just puts you in good standing and good readiness when it becomes a compliance obligation.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to have a go at that or add to those comments. Go on to the next question, and this unfortunately again is directed at Margot. So Margot, how do we select the best partners to transition to long-term sustainable practices?
You know, as a lawyer, I love myself a nice big due diligence. And so really that is maybe my starting point is a practice needs to develop, you know, within the sector, within business practices to actually appreciate the benefit of carrying out, you know, even if it's a high level due diligence exercise around the sustainability commitments, you know, of your partners, of your service providers, and how that fits in with your own strategy insofar as you have one, or where you're looking to position yourself from a sustainability perspective. Sophia mentioned something really, really great to hear, which was that, you know, questionnaires are sent out, you know, to check up, you know, whether your service providers have, you know, certain sustainability commitments. Do they subscribe to certain standards? Do they report, you know, their sustainability achievements or efforts or targets? So really, it's just about a simple, you know, it comes down, it can be simple in terms of asking general questions. You know, do you know, subscribe to some sort of an ISO management approach around your waste management and your water management? You know, what are your decarbonization efforts, in the sense that do you can you demonstrate to us that you have a renewable energy certificate that specifies how much renewable energy you utilize in your business? So it's those sort of important questions that should really form part of one's sort of procurement process in the space, that will guide you to at least having a sense of what a potential partner represents and commits to. And then, you know, taking it further insofar as incorporating, you know, those undertakings and warranting sort of adherence, if you want to take it that far, to sustainable practices, because it does really, again, it's this whole concept of a value chain. What one does at one end of the value chain will impact somebody else, you know, upstream. And, you know, the upstream player might really be taking all initiative and all effort to adopt and implement and practice sustainable practices within its business. so that it can leverage off the benefit of truthfully running with sort of the title of it being a sustainable or green service offering in the transport space specifically, but insofar as it is linked to an unsustainable partner, it really undoes all that effort and all that work, and affects corporations from a reputational perspective. But I'm sort of leaning into a question that I know will come up a little bit later in the session, but it really just comes down to and maybe also just having a good sense, and that's where we sort of see the benefit of having a tool such as a similar to a legal register, but that really does plot out the standards, the ISO requirements, the policies around sustainability within your sector. It would then guide one's questions when, undertaking procurement of partners and the like. So it sounds like a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be a lot of work, and it's actually very effective, and it's a risk mitigation practice really within one's business.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is directed at Sophia. How is technology helping the industry transition to more sustainable practices, and which technologies are leading the way in Africa, South Africa? I know you touched on some of them earlier when you were talking, but maybe you can just elaborate a bit more on that.
I actually wanted to say, I also just connected to the answer that Margot just gave there, because, and maybe if I can just touch on that quickly before I move on to the question that you just asked me now. That is, obviously I'm now sitting in a procurement role, but it's transport through and through. So I think one of the things that I look for in a partner is first the attitude, because when you start asking these questions to ourselves, but also to our partners, are a mirror. And sometimes, you don't like what you see, because then it tells you how far of a journey you need to go. But it's the attitude for me and my team when we start negotiating, or when we start selecting our partners, to say, you might not be where you want to be, but then let's do the assessment. Let's see where the gap is. And we can actually, if you meet all the requirements as far as what the need is, and you're able to sit down and we can formulate an action plan to close the gaps with clear timelines, and you commit to that and you show the progress, that already says to us, we're partnering with the right person. And you build those dipstick or those health checks in your process, either at the beginning of when you form the relationship, but we also have strategic ones that we've built in to say every 2 years these types of assessments need to be done, to still see, just to check in that your partner is still going in the right direction with you. And where they fell short, it's that turnaround strategy to get them to the right state, because not only our partners, but then also ourselves sometimes fall short in terms of our targets, and it's just, again, when it's not just a supplier who's rendering a service and it's a partnership, you're able to have those frank conversations. So yeah, I just in support of just what Margot was saying right now. But to answer your question, so with regards to technology now that we're utilizing, so I think we've all touched on alternative fuel solutions. So from a methanol, from a biodiesel, or natural gases. I think those are all the different options that get used. But then there's also the adoption of green technology, so electric vehicles, but then also your hydrogen powered vehicles. So and I think when we talk about hydrogen, you also talk about hydrogen fuel cells. And for those of you that are just, I think, because sometimes I think I saw in some of the people that joined, we've got individuals that are straight out of school, So hydrogen fuel cells basically generate electricity through, there's a chemical reaction that happens between hydrogen and oxygen, and that reaction then produces energy. And those are just some of the options that you use. And I think especially when we start talking around the different technologies, there's normally like a focus on what happens from a trucking perspective, but then, you know, sitting in this space, obviously one of the areas that I look after is warehousing. And MHE is a big portion of how we drive decarbonization. So you've got options like your lithium battery operated trucks. Obviously, that's a low density, long performance, high energy solution. But then you also have the transition. So you can also then migrate some of your diesel machines into electric machines. So they basically build the electric forklift on a diesel chassis. And that type of forklift is actually even more suitable for use outside. It's got like bigger wheels, so then also in terms of the movement, and some of these things when I talk about the movement, etc., might not sound like a big deal, but for those of you that are in operational roles, I know you're probably sitting there, you're like, that is critical. So those are just some of the things that, you know, in terms of green technologies that we can bring in. And I just want to also reiterate the conversation around the setup of some of these, again, can be scary. But when you start doing this piece of work, the total cost of ownership as an exercise needs to be done. Because when you start seeing what it starts driving operationally, on a monthly basis, you realize that the total cost of ownership, there's such a larger benefit longer term than probably immediately. And then in terms of renewable energy, we can't run away from solar and wind. I mean, at the moment, for an example, we're building 2 cold storages, one in Cato Ridge and one in the Balkan area. And with both these cold stores, we understand the amount of energy usage that would come from powering cold storage facilities. And I've just closed my negotiation now with the solar partner for Balkan, and I'm about to do the same for the Cato Ridge solution. So, you know, that again underpins our commitment in terms of making sure that we drive the right conversation. And when we're speaking about the evaluation of our service providers, we actually have AI enabled assessments of an evaluation of our service providers or our partners. You know, I think so. Basically, that cuts probably like half of the time that you needed to actually get this information, and it ensures that again we identify those gaps and how we support them as quickly as possible. I also saw one of the comments when you talk about like which countries where are we seeing technology being utilized a lot. I think Nigeria stands out beautifully for us in terms of like some of the main examples that we're seeing. There's Sabi's Trace platform that exists, and that's actually in the blockchain field, right? And it ensures like your ethical sourcing and environmental compliance, like within the trade. I think in Kenya you've got I think it's the Turkana wind plant, which even if you look at it just domestically, it's just not even from and that's a perfect example of where industry has come together in formalizing a solution. I think from a domestic perspective, in terms of households, can power up about 1 million households, right? And let alone what it can do in terms of actual industry impact. And I think those are just some of the examples that come to mind.
Thank you very much. And I think maybe just following up on that, directed at you, but also any of the other panelists, as we're on the topic of technology, what role do you see AI having in terms of helping organizations in the sector drive sustainability initiatives, support them? Have you seen any benefits or any good case studies of how it's being used?
I mean, like I think for us, like I said, we're already using AI, right? So when we start talking about tracking or MHE, that machine learning and understanding that
Yes.
the data that comes through and and I think the most important thing is sometimes, sometimes you're running a machine, but then you've got certain questions in terms of, okay, when is the operating, when is the stop time, when is the best, when is the best time to utilize it? But now with machine learning and all these types of like AI or machine learning particularly, that information is available to you quite quickly. And that's the thing. Instead of having someone sitting there trying to do a time motion study, for example, that information now is so easily accessible and available to you. So I see the impact of AI or machine learning, I think, grow over the next few years. I think it is critical. It's something that, I mean, even now, one of the negotiations that I also just closed off is a national RFP for MHE. And when you start talking mixed telematics and all the other all the other interventions that include your AI piece,
Yes.
those were part of the discussions. Those are elements that we brought in not only in the just the portion of the contract in the clauses, but also in terms of the standard operating procedures. So now there's
Brilliant.
then you need to then so then you have the conversation in terms of the overall agreement or the overall agreement, but then you start talking, how do we operationalize it? So then in terms of we start talking like the SOP, then the ops team start giving in their input, and then you have even a deeper collaboration with the partners that you've selected.
Great, thank you. Professor.
Joshua, please. Thank you. I think AI will play a very, very critical role in the future, but it has two sides, really. The positive side of it, that it will save us a lot of time. So the example Sophia just gave about analyzing data and giving background of things, and it will save huge amount of time. The negative issue is we may in sometimes depend on it to make decisions. And if we don't make decisions using the human intelligence and apply our own mind to the data collected and analyzed by AI, we will face a lot of setbacks in the future. So I think we need to balance between the introduction of AI as a tool to save time and the usage of AI for decision making. So we still need our leaders, strategic thinkers, CEOs, managers. They need to be the decision makers rather than being dependent on AI tools analysis. And as in research, you don't collect the data and analyze them and then present them without applying your mind. So again, there is a danger of relying on the analysis of AI to be considered as 100% accurate. And yes, we are moving forward, we will improve and so on, but we still need to be careful in drawing the line between when to depend and when not to depend on AI as tools. So yeah, it's a very still complicated issue to have a clear vision about.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question, which Professor's also directed at you and Sophia and IK. I think it's just all around, is net zero a realistic goal for the industry? And if so, how do we get there? I know we've kind of touched on this question a few times in various ways over the past hour, but maybe you could just elaborate on that. Is it realistic? And if so, how do we get there realistically?
Can I start by maybe challenging the question and say that, do we really need to reach net zero? In my opinion, in Africa, net zero isn't just an environmental goal. It's a negotiation game. So emissions reduction is very important, but the reality is many African nations have more immediate priorities. Economic growth, job creation, poverty reduction. So we are unlike the developed countries. Our economies still rely heavily on fossil fuels, for example. So simply, we can't afford to phase out our systems overnight without risking economic setbacks. But on the other side, sustainability cannot be ignored. So we need to balance between the environmental goals and the economic realities. So we don't rush into net zero at the same pace as the wealthier nations, but we need to focus on gradual practical steps like improving our fuel efficiency, investing in cleaner technologies, building infrastructure that supports long-term transition, and so on. So is net zero still achievable? So that was your question. And I think, yes, it is, but only within a structured approach. So the first step in this structured approach may be cutting emissions from the transport sector. Road fleet must transition to electric, hydrogen-powered vehicles backed by proper charging and refueling infrastructure. Expanding and improving our rail network will definitely help shifting freight of roles. Maritime and aviation industries should adopt biofuels, synthetic fuels, modern fleet upgrades to reduce emissions. So energy transition is another important factor. For example, logistics hubs and warehouses can integrate renewable energy, and this was discussed earlier today. Sophia was talking earlier about the software, so digital tools and solutions. The AI we just talked about, Internet of Things, which is established science now, can also play a very pivotal role in our steps. Circular economy principles must be taken into consideration seriously. So there are barriers. Don't ignore the barriers, especially the economic factor. The grid technology is generally expensive. Our infrastructure is limited. Our businesses, they may struggle to afford sustainable alternatives. So the government and institutions must come in with solutions like incentives, tax breaks, and so on. Public-private partnership is very important to achieve net zero or close to net zero. The bottom line is, yes, net zero is challenging, but it is not impossible. And for developing countries, we have to focus on gradual, realistic progress rather than unrealistic deadlines.
Thank you, Professor IK. Would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you very much once again. And yes, talking about the reality of net zero, it's quite imperative that we know that we need to create a balance and also look at the African market and its dynamic, right? So you see a situation where the innovations are quite extensive, but then also look at the way, the roadmap at which we're going to achieve this net zero. It might take some time, but I feel it's achievable. But it's going to take some time because a couple of things have to be put into perspective. So we look at the energy transition and efficiency of what it currently is at the moment, and what gaps do we identify during this transition process. How do we put up mitigation plans to see that we can resolve all of these gaps and also build a sustainable process over time. And we also look at policies and regulatory compliance across the different nations in Africa. So what's the level of compliance and what kind of policies are in place that would help drive the net zero initiative? All of those things have to be put into consideration. And also the global alignment on operations. sustainability. So we look at what is happening in the globe, what's happening in other continents, how do we tie up these innovations to what we are currently doing in Africa, and also look at the learning points from what is happening on the global scale. Then also in technology and innovation is quite critical. How do we adopt technologies and innovations? So if you put all of those things into consideration, you see that over time, we might be able to achieve net zero, but it probably will take some time, but it's achievable. Because you see, there's going to be full transition into electric vehicle, EV trucks, basically, and other infrastructures that have to do with the green energy. So we kind of see that from a geometrical progression perspective, it is doable. The renewable energy consumption would improve. There's this very, very good push from solar energy, which is driving the African market real fast. And over time, we'll see that whatever we do expect in terms of net zero, it's going to be achievable. It's, like I said earlier, it's going to take some time.
Thank you. Sophia, would you like to add anything to that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, not much. I think probably okay. I think they touched on it. Like I mean, it is true. Is it realistic? Yes. Is it easy? Of course not. And I think the timelines thereof, because now we're talking for the industry, right? That means, and for the industry, that means that as we're talking about, internally, we all need to look at the long-term view. Then from the industry, that means the timeline is going to be longer, right? But I think then the call, linking into what Prof said, is around economic excess. We cannot run away from that, especially as this particular continent, understanding the inequalities that exist not only as individuals, but then even then as different countries and therefore different companies. From a MERS perspective, for example, net zero target was actually the target was sitting for 2050, and we even brought it forward to 2040. Saying that we will achieve it by 2040 because, right, we can leverage the global reach and the size of Maersk, and we've got access to fleet modernization where now we're introducing vessels that are powered by alternative fuels. We've got the collaborative partnerships, like forming coalitions with certain partners again to make sure that we drive a common ESG agenda. So yes, we could do that, but then it's about all the big players that do have that economic access. Once you've got your program and your program is clearly running well, how do you then look at the smaller guy and then start supporting them? Because that's the only way that, because then it's not looking at it just individually. Then when you start sharing the knowledge, sharing the insights, then we can start moving along as an entire industry. But then it is making sure that equity is driven in that way to say, and that's why I'm saying equity and not equality, because it's about the likes of the bigger players like your Maersk, using the power, the influence, and the insights and the learning to then share with the smaller guys and making sure that everyone kind of comes along on the journey with us.
Excellent. Yeah, and again, I think you used the term ESG. I mean, a lot of today's discussion's been around decarbonisation, net zero, but I mean, obviously the topic is on sustainability, and there's more to sustainability than that. There's the social impact or social part, which I would argue in a lot of cases, especially in Africa, is sometimes more important than necessarily the E in ESG. How are you seeing companies kind of adapt or balance the needs between environmental and social kind of considerations or initiatives? Because sometimes those can be in conflict with each other. And I'm putting that out to the panel, so I don't know if anyone wants to have a go at answering that one. It's a contentious question, just like my next one is going to be. No.
Look, I'm gonna give it a stab, but then I think I think in terms of where it starts getting very contentious in terms of the three letters that you speak of. It also then is influenced by, I think, what we started talking about, myself and Lusanda, on the strategy. So I'm in a position, or we as Maersk are now in a position where we can benefit from the integrated strategy that we have. Which obviously now means that we're leveraging off the fact that we're no longer just an ocean business. We're an ocean and land side, right? Now we've now combined it to say that now this is our offering to the market, to the customers, where it's, it's about that conversion. And once you start looking at the conversion from the ocean customer to either air to land side, to then a warehouse customer, to then a palletized final mile, then we're looking at that full chain. Because of this integration, the ESG or the effort towards ESG remains connected, because then it requires a certain level of collaboration and a certain type of conversation and honesty, where we can't be going in different directions. The strategy forces everything that it's now starting to have a knock-on effect, and a positive one at that, to say that everything needs to work together. I think where you're going to start seeing like the friction that you were speaking of is exactly that, where there might be a mother company, but then the different divisions are pushing in different directions, even just in terms of their operational profit strategy. Because and that's why it's such an integrated approach. Then also starts connecting elements of and particularly when you said the S and the G.
Yes. Yeah.
I think I would add that it can only be contentious mainly because of the view that it adds obligations to a company, and that it adds as well. But I think it's important to also view it as an opportunity, because the world that we are living in and the direction that we're going is, it's going to be critical to access finance, which impacts your current bottom line, your growth strategy as a company. It's your how you relate to your consumers as well. This is something that you can use as a way of increasing your potential, for instance, depending on how well you do it. So there's many ways to view it, but I think it's an opportunity to again bring in that competitive, especially if you adopt early, bring in that competitive, so that you're a company that can survive the next 50 years or 100 years because of how often being an early adopter.
I just bring it up because I think these discussions become very Eurocentric or US-centric, and the focus there is obviously very much around net zero and decarbonisation. But I think in particular in Africa, we've got broader issues, around community engagement and uplifting societies. So the social aspect, in some ways, might need to take preference. But what you say around setting that as intentionally as part of your strategy from the start is very insightful and useful. Okay, I'm going to move on to my next kind of contentious question, the one that I've been eager to ask this whole webinar. We all know that we've now entered a time of Trump, and we've seen the impact that's had. I think on his first day, he signed one of the executive orders, was rolling back some of the subsidies for EVs. Obviously, he's trying to very much drive the oil and gas industry again, and pulled out of the Paris Agreement and various other things that the US government's doing. And I think as a result, I saw a large petrochemical company the other day announcing that they're rolling back on all their DEI initiatives. They're canning all their initiatives, ESG initiatives. So what kind of impact do you think this is going to have on sustainability within the sector in particular? Do you see that this momentum will continue now, and that you'll see more companies moving away from sustainability? And again, I'm putting that out to anyone that's willing to take the question.
If I may try. Okay, we have seen already Trump taking the steps by withdrawing from Paris Agreement. So we really don't know what he is doing exactly, withdrawing, or is just say, but the effect of politics is unpredictable. It can be positive, it can be negative, but at the moment, from one side, we can see that there is a lot of funds which will go away from sustainability. Sustainability will not be priority for at least United States. But on the other side, the EU is taking sustainability more seriously. And I don't see that they are moving away from this trend in the near future. But again, let me repeat, it's unpredictable. So we just depend on the current situation. So it can be looked at as an opportunity for the African countries to link more with EU or other countries which are taking sustainability more seriously. Why? Because this can open an opportunity for the African countries to replace maybe the American companies, for example, which can find it difficult in the future to work in Europe because of and Canada because of the tension, because of the regulations, because of the taxes, and so on. So it can be not only an opportunity for us, but an insurance policy that we have we are providing something. It was very difficult for us to compete with American companies, but now we are providing something with less competition because the American companies are not there. But on the other side, we can't ignore the Chinese companies and their effect. And Losanda early talked about their development and so on. So geopolitics in general won't decide Africa's sustainability future, but our adaptability will. So companies and government that treat green policies as a shield against global shocks, I think, will survive.
Thank you, Professor. Lusanda, Margot, would you like to add to that? Or? No. I think the sense I get also speaking to companies and just touching on what some of you have said, obviously, during this webinar is I think companies are increasingly realizing that there are broader benefits to sustainability and taking it seriously. I mean, going back to what Margot was saying about having it as a crucial thing in terms of accessing financing and investments, I think definitely we're seeing that if you want to stay ahead of your competitors in terms of your USPs, your sustainability initiatives are a key way of doing that. And I've seen increasingly, even within our industry that we operate in, that a lot of young people now, are looking to the companies that they work for to drive a lot of these initiatives and are making it part of their kind of decision criteria if they're looking to join a company or stay at a company. So it's becoming crucially important, I think, to attract and retain key talent, I think, across sectors. But I don't know if anyone on the panel would like to add other things that you've seen companies, benefits that companies have derived from, again, taking sustainability seriously and integrating it into their strategies.
Josh, maybe just one sort of point that I've identified, when I think a lot of us have seen it already, is I guess the reputational benefits, associating your company being associated with sustainable practices, sort of does position that entity, that company within the market, and will attract similar subscribers to those principles in terms of business. So, I mean, there is obviously the risk to that as well, of sort of leveraging off sustainability and sort of the use of the term green. There has to be really careful consideration when adopting that and running with that image. But there is an absolute benefit to it as well.
Yeah. And then I think, Marco, maybe just following up on that, maybe just talking around the terms greenwashing. I heard terms social washing and God washing the other day. Companies, what are the sort of, first of all, what do those terms mean? And second of all, are you able to share some examples of where it's gone wrong and what the implications have been, where you've got companies that are claiming to have these green credentials or sustainability credentials, and they've been greenwashing, and what's happened as a result of that?
Sure. I think in a nutshell, greenwashing can really sort of just be described as a misrepresentation to the market around your sort of, or around the genuineness of your sustainability commitments and practices. It's a real risk, especially in terms of consumer confidence in a company. If it comes to light that what you are purporting to be your stance and your efforts to achieve sustainable business practices, and those are either falsified or can be disputed, then, I mean, that again, it goes to the reputational benefit, and then of course the reputational harm, which is perhaps one of the most significant harms or risks. I mean, over and above the potential litigation that stems from greenwashing claims. But I mean, it can severely impact a company's position in the market, its image in the market. And so that's why, we're seeing, we can only assume that there's a benefit because there's been such an uptake in adopting sort of ESG policies within the company, and sustainability commitments or targets. On one hand, you have to wonder, okay, is this just sort of a move in the market, just everybody sort of following each other and thinking that it's necessary to do without giving it much thought as to what it actually takes and requires. The amount of work to actually achieve and demonstrate, the efforts taken in terms of these policies that a company adopts. So it's all in all a very important commitment, and a company must literally do that, commit to it with a level of genuineness, because the fallback or the real risks again are being called out for, really misleading, either your partners, your investors, your lenders, and the other stakeholders such as civil society. And that goes a long way in terms of how it impacts a business. I mean, the good, I mean, that international, or the sort of a standout case is VW's claims around its emissions and how those were in actual fact not what they purported to be. And America, there's such an increase in greenwashing litigation. This is a little bit sort of outside of transport and logistics, but something as simple as claiming that the material or the inputs to manufacturing a pair of jeans is sustainable, when in actual fact it isn't. So when making those commitments, they need to be measurable. You need to have a process in place where you can back them up with genuine data and reports. I mean, I once advised major petroleum company who was looking to, and I mean, we need to appreciate that the petroleum industry is a very hard to abate sector by its nature. But, you know, it was looking to offset its impacts, you know, by the implementation of a nature-based type solution, but appreciated that if that was not considered thoroughly, it was a real risk to their company. And so they took it back to the drawing board, rightfully so, to make sure that what was actually implemented achieved what a nature-based solution is, you know, created to achieve, and that it's an actual genuine measurable decrease in the carbon footprint. It just comes down to accountability, and that you have the genuine data, and that you sort of really develop you know, these strategies on solutions that will have a measurable difference, and that's the tricky part, is measuring the actual you know, the actual target, and whether it's been achieved.
Okay, well, look, thank you. It's now 3:22. We're coming to the end of our webinar. So unfortunately, we didn't get through all the questions, and I can see there've been a lot of questions that have come in on the Q&A. But I think we're going to have to start wrapping up. So I have put my email address in the chat. I'll do that again now too. Please feel free to contact me directly if you've got questions that we didn't get to during the webinar, and I can try and direct it to one of the panelists. And to my fellow panelists, thank you very much for joining me on this really interesting webinar and sharing all your fascinating insights. I'd just like to do a bit of a round robin and maybe just some closing remarks from each of you. So, Professor, if you'd like to go first, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. First, I would like to thank DMG for the opportunity and for the wonderful panel. I enjoyed really the discussion today and listened to very good minds. And I think that the sustainability is the way to go. And we need to discuss more about how to implement sustainability in transportation in a way that suits us as South Africa and the African continent. And taking into consideration our socio-economic issues and our own targets as a country and as a continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Lusanda, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah, I concur with the professor. This was a really interesting discussion, and thank you for the invitation. I would conclude by saying that part of what we discussed about the geopolitical headwinds will obviously have a very big impact on the sector and where we land in a couple of years, because now we are already seeing some rollback from some major companies, global companies, rolling back on their targets, and that, you know, DEI being the anti-DEI message coming out of the US, the trade and tariff wars. So a lot of things are sort of up in the air now, and we really need to really look and see over the next 4 years where the sector is going to be, what it actually means for sustainable practices. I do hope that in the bigger scheme of things and overall we'll sort of be moving in the right direction, even though we're obviously going to go through a period of a down period. But I think overall, this is an unstoppable train, and I hope that more and more companies will recognize how they need to get ahead of this curve, as we've been discussing all afternoon.
Great, thank you. Sophia.
Yeah, thank you again for the invitation, and to my fellow panelists for the great conversation. And yeah, Josh, thank you. I think you've done a fabulous job at facilitating
Thank you. Well, I had a great panel.
I've really enjoyed the discussions, and I think also thought-provoking for, I think, individually as we go back into our own spaces, Look, not much to say. Climate change is real. It's not a make-believe concept. And all the work that we've all been doing and all the work that has been done has made a dent. It's made a change. It's made an impact. I think I just wanted to say that the work continues and the mission remains. And I think as long as all of us that are as part of this conversation, and to everyone that's joining, yeah, the mission continues. And let's just stay committed to making a positive impact.
Thank you. Margot.
Thanks so much, Josh, and thanks as well to my fellow panelists. I've learned a lot from this, from this hour and a half that I want to look into from a legal perspective, certainly. But I think what is important, and maybe what is the takeaway, is that the transport sector has an incredibly big role to play in South Africa, taking all reasonable measures to achieve its NDC, and that impact and shouldn't be underestimated as to what can be achieved in the sector, and that the sector and the stakeholders therein should really just continue having these sorts of discussions to identify, where are the stumbling blocks, what are the hurdles, how they can come together as a sector to go to government to, put the requirements down as to what will make this sustainability push feasible in a sector that has such a big impact. And just hopefully, just those conversations are material, and hopefully government will be there to support.
Excellent.
Thanks.
And last but not least, IK, can you still hear us?
Yes, very well. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm also using this opportunity to thank the fellow panelists. It was quite insightful, there was quite a lot of information, key learnings, and knowledge sharing across board. And the way to go is the sustainable practice. It's something that the African market needs to take into due consideration. Yes, we've seen some trend. We hope that maybe next we sit in another panel, we would have witnessed some significant changes. Once again, I thank everyone for the opportunity to come join you, and also for all we've discussed today. It's quite insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you to my amazing panel. It was a really interesting and insightful webinar, and to all our attendees. We had at one stage over 170 attendees from across the world. Thank you very much for staying on for the full webinar. Again, please feel free to email me directly if you've got questions that we didn't get to during this webinar. And we look forward to welcoming you to Transport Evolution Africa, again taking place 17th to 19th of June, Gallagher Convention Centre in Johannesburg, South Africa. For more information, you can visit the site again at www.transportevolution.com. And yeah, thank you very much. See you at the next webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much, Josh. Just before we close off, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us all. Thank you so much to Josh for moderating, and to our guest speakers, Sophia Sibanda from AP Molo Maersk, Margot Ann Werner from Pinsent Mason, Lusanda Madikizela from C40 Cities, Ikponwosa Egaiva from Emzor Pharmaceutical Industries in Nigeria, and Professor Mohamed Mustafa from the University of KwaZulu-Natal for a very engaging panel discussion. You've all contributed to making this webinar a success. If you have any further questions or would like to continue the conversation, you can feel free to reach out to me at shannon@creamermedia.co.za, or as Josh said, to him on joshualo@dmgevents.com. And if you're interested in hearing more about the Transport Evolution Forum, you can visit the website at www.transportevolution.com. I also launched a poll earlier, should you require more information about the conference. And with that, I'd like to bid you all farewell. Thank you so much for your time, and goodbye.